Single father adopts black twins rejected by 13 families, then discovers their birth certificate. Welcome to a heartwarming story of love, loss, and new beginnings. Join Ethan as he navigates the bittersweet journey of fatherhood, raising twin girls while honoring the memory of his daughter, Grace, through challenges and cherished moments. This tale will remind you of the enduring power of family and hope. Ethan Harris stood at the window of his quiet, empty house, staring out at the swing set in the backyard. The chains creaked softly in the breeze, a haunting reminder of laughter long since silenced. His heart ached as he remembered the way his daughter, Grace, used to plead, "Daddy, push me higher." Her voice, full of joy, echoed through his mind, stirring up the familiar pain that had gripped his soul for the past 3 years. It felt like only yesterday that she was there, filling the house with her light. The accident that took Grace away left Ethan shattered. 3 years had passed, but time hadn't dulled the grief. Each day felt like he was learning to breathe again in a world that was too quiet, too empty without her. The house stood frozen in time, a shrine to Grace's memory. Her toys still sat on the shelves, her favorite stuffed bunny placed carefully on her small bed, as if she might walk in at any moment and reach for it. Ethan hadn't changed a thing. Somehow, keeping everything just as it was gave him the illusion that he was keeping her close. He wandered into the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The scent of coffee brewing did little to lift his spirits as he sat down at the table, staring into the dark liquid. The emptiness inside him mirrored the quiet house. Without Grace's smile, her laughter, and her warm little presence, the world felt meaningless. He ran his hand over one of her crayon drawings still stuck to the fridge with colorful magnets, a stick figure labeled Daddy next to a smiling son. "I miss you so much, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He had never imagined life without her. And yet, here he was, moving through the days with nothing but memories to hold on to. Lately, thoughts of adoption had begun to creep into his mind. The idea both terrified and intrigued him. Could he ever love another child after Grace? Wouldn't that be a betrayal to her memory? Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the coffee cup to his lips, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. The thought of loving again, of nurturing another life, felt almost impossible, but the loneliness in the house was becoming unbearable. Maybe, just maybe, opening his heart again was the only way forward. "What would you think, Grace?" he asked the empty room, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you want Daddy to be happy again?" Tears slid down his cheeks as he wrestled with the guilt. The desire to love and protect another child was at war with his fear of replacing Grace. Could he risk the pain of losing someone again? And if he did adopt, would he be enough for that child, knowing that part of his heart would always belong to Grace? The next day, Ethan found himself parked in front of Oakwood Family Services. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't entirely sure how he had gotten here. The adoption agency was supposed to be just a visit, just a way to gather information. But even walking through the door felt like a monumental step. Inside, the cheerful decor and children's artwork on the walls tugged at his heartstrings. It reminded him too much of Grace's old preschool, her tiny hand in his as they walked into class together. He swallowed the lump in his throat and approached the receptionist. "I have an appointment with Mrs. Roberts," he said, his voice quiet but steady. A few moments later, a kind-faced woman with graying hair greeted him. "Mr. Harris, I'm Mrs. Roberts. Please, come in," she said warmly, leading him into her cozy office. As he sat down, his nerves were evident, his hands clasped tightly together. He felt exposed, like his grief was written all over his face. "So, you're interested in adoption?" Mrs. Roberts asked gently, her eyes full of understanding. Ethan nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I lost my daughter a few years ago. I think I'm ready to open my heart again. But I don't know. It's complicated. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Harris. It takes great courage to even consider adoption after such a tragedy." Mrs. Roberts said softly, her tone filled with compassion. As they talked, Ethan felt some of his tension ease. Mrs. Roberts had a way of making him feel like he wasn't alone. Like this journey of grief and potential healing was one he didn't have to navigate by himself. She explained the adoption process, patiently answering all of his questions. But then she hesitated, her expression shifting slightly. "There's a particular case I'd like to discuss with you," she began. "We have twin baby girls, Olivia and Abigail, who need a home." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Twins? He hadn't considered that possibility. Mrs. Roberts continued, her voice gentle. "These little ones have had a very difficult start. They've been rejected by 13 families already." 13? Ethan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "But why?" Mrs. Roberts sighed. "The girls have some emotional challenges due to their past. They need extra patience and care. Many families weren't prepared for that commitment." Ethan felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Compassion for the tiny lives that had already faced so much rejection. But also doubt. Could he really handle this? Was he ready for such a challenge? Especially when his heart was still so raw. "Would you like to meet them?" Mrs. Roberts asked softly, giving him space to make a decision. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say yes immediately, but fear held him back. He wasn't sure if he could bear the weight of responsibility. But something in him stirred, a quiet voice urging him to take the leap. Yes, I'd like to meet them," he said finally, his voice shaky but determined. Mrs. Roberts smiled kindly and led him down the hallway to the nursery. Ethan's heart raced as they approached the room where Olivia and Abigail waited. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it, the moment that could change everything. As they entered, Ethan's eyes fell on two tiny cribs side by side. In them lay two beautiful baby girls, no more than 6 months old. They looked so small, so vulnerable. He felt a lump form in his throat, and the familiar ache of grief mingled with something new, a faint, fragile hope. "This is Olivia," Mrs. Roberts said softly, gesturing to the baby on the left. "And this is Abigail." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes taking in every detail. Olivia lay quietly, her big brown eyes watching him curiously, while Abigail wiggled and cooed, reaching out with chubby hands. "Would you like to hold one of them?" Mrs. Roberts asked gently. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. When Mrs. Roberts placed Olivia in his arms, the weight of the tiny baby felt both familiar and strange. Olivia looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and for a moment, Ethan felt his heart crack open. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience since Grace. "Hi there, Olivia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's nice to meet you." Olivia reached up, her tiny hand brushing against his cheek, and the simple gesture nearly undid him. Ethan blinked back tears, his mind whirling. Was this the beginning of something new? Could he really open his heart again? Not just to one child, but to two? As he looked over at Abigail, who was now sitting up in her crib, watching him intently, Ethan felt a shift inside. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of possibility. Ethan sat in the small office adjacent to the nursery, his mind reeling. He had just held Olivia, one of the twin girls who, until now, had been nothing more than names on a file. But the moment she had looked up at him, her tiny hand brushing against his cheek, something shifted inside him. And now, Abigail's big brown eyes were fixed on him, as if waiting for her turn to be held. He could feel his heart pulling in two directions, toward the desire to care for these two small lives and toward the weight of uncertainty that still hung over him. Mrs. Roberts sat across from him, her expression kind but serious. She had seen this moment play out many times before, but she knew Ethan's situation was different. His grief was still fresh, and adopting twins, especially ones with emotional challenges, was no small decision. "Mr. Harris," Mrs. Roberts began softly, breaking the silence. "There's something important you need to know about Olivia and Abigail." Her voice was gentle, but Ethan could feel the weight of the words coming. He straightened up in his chair, bracing himself. "I had a feeling there was more," he said, his voice steady but cautious. Mrs. Roberts nodded. "These girls, They've had a very difficult start in life. Their biological parents passed away in a tragic accident shortly after they were born. They spent their first few months in a chaotic environment. There was neglect, and because of that, they may face some developmental challenges as they grow. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He thought about the little girls he had just seen, so small and innocent, and yet they had already endured more than most children ever should. He wasn't naive. He knew adoption wasn't easy, especially with children who came from difficult circumstances. But hearing it out loud made the reality sink in deeper. Mrs. Roberts continued, her voice firm but compassionate. They're going to need extra care, patience, and love. Many families have struggled to commit to that, which is why, as I mentioned, they've already been rejected by 13 families. 13 families. That number alone felt like a blow to Ethan's heart. How could anyone turn their backs on such beautiful children? But he also understood the fear. He was feeling it himself, the doubt creeping in. Could he give these girls the kind of love and stability they needed? What if he failed them? He ran a hand over his face, trying to gather his thoughts. I won't lie to you, he said finally, his voice low. I'm scared. I lost my daughter, Grace, a few years ago, and I'm still dealing with that. I don't know if I can handle something like this. What if I'm not enough for them? Mrs. Roberts leaned forward, her eyes soft with understanding. It's normal to feel that way. Ethan, these little girls will need a lot of care. Yes, but I can tell you from experience, what children like Olivia and Abigail need most is someone who won't give up on them. Someone who's willing to walk through the hard times with them. And from what I've seen, you have that strength inside you. Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years trying to be strong, holding himself together after Grace's death. But this was different. This was about stepping into the unknown, opening his heart again, and risking it all. And he didn't know if he could. Do you want to hold Abigail? Mrs. Roberts asked gently, breaking the silence. Ethan blinked, as if he had forgotten where he was for a moment. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and stood up. Mrs. Roberts led him back into the nursery, where Abigail was still sitting in her crib, her eyes watching him curiously. She was different from Olivia, more animated, more eager to interact. Mrs. Roberts lifted Abigail carefully and handed her to Ethan. As soon as Abigail was in his arms, she wiggled and cooed, her tiny hands reaching up to touch his face, just like Olivia had done. But this time, Ethan couldn't hold back the flood of emotions. The weight of the tiny child in his arms felt both overwhelming and grounding. And as he looked into Abigail's wide, trusting eyes, he felt something break inside him. He sat down in the rocking chair, cradling Abigail close, and the tears he had been holding back for so long finally spilled over. It wasn't just the grief for Grace. It was everything, the loneliness, the fear, the guilt, and now, the overwhelming love that was starting to grow for these two little girls. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry I wasn't ready before. I didn't know if I could do this. His words were for Grace, for Olivia and Abigail, and for himself. He had been holding on to so much pain, afraid to let go, afraid to move forward. But here, with Abigail in his arms, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to heal. Abigail reached up again, her tiny fingers brushing away the tears on his cheeks. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a sign. Ethan had lost so much, but maybe he could find something new, something beautiful, in the love of these two little girls. Mrs. Roberts watched from the doorway, giving him space. She knew this was a decision Ethan had to make for himself, but she could see the change in him. The walls he had built around his heart were starting to come down, brick by brick. After a long moment, Ethan stood up, still holding Abigail. He walked over to Olivia's crib and gazed down at her. She was still awake, her big brown eyes watching him intently, as if she knew something important was happening. Ethan reached down and gently stroked her cheek. I don't know how this is going to work, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm going to try. I promise you both. I'll try. The weight of the decision settled over him, but it wasn't as heavy as he had feared. It felt right. Scary. Yes, but right. As he handed Abigail back to Mrs. Roberts, she smiled gently. You don't have to decide right now. Ethan, she said, take some time to think about it. Adoption is a big step. Ethan nodded, knowing he would need time to process everything. But as he walked out of the nursery and down the hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had already shifted. The emptiness he had carried for so long was still there. But now, there was something else, a spark of hope, a possibility of healing. The drive home was quiet. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of Olivia and Abigail, of Grace, and of the future he had never imagined for himself. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the house that had been his refuge and his prison for the past 3 years. As he stepped inside, the silence greeted him, as it always did, but this time, it didn't feel as oppressive. He walked through the house, his fingers brushing over the pictures of Grace on the walls, the toys still neatly arranged in her room. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, memories flooding back. The love he had for her would never fade. But maybe, just maybe, there was room in his heart for more. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan thought about Olivia and Abigail, about their tiny hands reaching out to him, about the way their eyes had seemed to hold so much hope despite the pain they had endured. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't ready to let them go either. Before he drifted off to sleep, he whispered to the darkness, "We'll figure it out together." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. He spent long hours pacing his house, the silence amplifying the noise of his thoughts. Every time he walked past Grace's room, he stopped, peering in, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him. The room was still exactly as she had left it, her bed neatly made, her favorite stuffed bunny perched against the pillows, and the colorful drawings on the walls, each one a small reminder of the life that had once filled the house with laughter. But now, it wasn't just memories of Grace that occupied Ethan's mind. It was Olivia and Abigail, the two little girls with big brown eyes who had stared up at him with such innocence and trust. He couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, their paths were meant to cross. He sat at the kitchen table one morning, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he stared out the window. The swing set outside creaked in the wind, and he could almost hear Grace's voice, laughing, begging him to push her higher. A familiar ache gripped his chest, but this time, it wasn't as sharp. It was a dull throb, a reminder of the love he had once felt so deeply. And a question: was there room in his heart for more? The phone rang, startling Ethan out of his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. It was mid-morning, and he hadn't planned on hearing from anyone. When he picked up the phone, Mrs. Roberts' warm voice greeted him on the other end. "Ethan, I just wanted to check in with you," she said gently. "I know this is a big decision, and I wanted to give you some space, but I also didn't want you to feel alone in this." Ethan appreciated the sentiment. Mrs. Roberts had been kind and understanding from the moment they met, and he knew she had dealt with many families in similar situations. But somehow, this felt different. This wasn't just any decision. This was a decision that would change his life forever. "I've been thinking about them, about Olivia and Abigail," Ethan admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "But I don't know if I'm ready. I don't even know if I can do this." Mrs. Roberts paused, letting his words hang in the air before she responded. "It's okay to be scared, Ethan. In fact, it would be more concerning if you weren't. But I believe you have the capacity to love these girls. And more importantly, they need someone who's willing to try. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there." Ethan swallowed, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He didn't need to be perfect, but he needed to be present. And wasn't that what he had promised Grace? Too, that he would always be there for her, even when she wasn't physically with him anymore. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing again at the swing set outside, the chain still swaying gently in the breeze. He could almost see Olivia and Abigail running through the yard, their laughter filling the empty spaces of his home, bringing life back to where there had only been silence. "Can I see them again?" Ethan asked, surprising himself with the question. His heart was pounding, but he knew that he needed to see the girls one more time. to look into their eyes and feel that connection again. Mrs. Roberts smiled on the other end of the line. Of course, I think that would be a great idea. How about tomorrow? I'll arrange everything. Ethan agreed, and after they hung up, he sat for a long time at the kitchen table, the silence of the house feeling different now. There was anticipation, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. Underscore, 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 underscore. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside Oakwood Family Services once again. His palms were sweaty, his heart racing as he took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. It felt surreal to be here again, as if everything in his life was leading up to this moment. Mrs. Roberts greeted him with her usual warm smile, but there was a glint of encouragement in her eyes this time. "They're in the nursery, just like before," she said softly. "Take your time." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with nerves as he followed her down the hallway. The cheerful artwork on the walls didn't affect him the same way it had before. This time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason for being here that went beyond curiosity. When they entered the nursery, Ethan's heart swelled at the sight of Olivia and Abigail in their cribs. Olivia was lying quietly, her big brown eyes scanning the room, while Abigail was sitting up, cooing and wiggling with excitement. The sight of them, so small and vulnerable, stirred something deep within Ethan. It was a mix of protectiveness, love, and fear, but this time, the fear didn't feel so overwhelming. Mrs. Roberts stepped back, giving him space as he approached the cribs. Ethan knelt down next to Olivia, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. She blinked up at him, her eyes curious but calm. "Hey there, Olivia," he whispered. "It's me again. I've been thinking about you a lot." He reached over and took Abigail's hand, her fingers curling around his instantly. Abigail gurgled, a sound that made Ethan's heart soften. The connection he had felt the first time was still there, but now it was stronger, more real. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, staring at the two girls. They were so tiny, so full of potential, but also so fragile. He could feel the weight of their future in his hands, their need for stability, for love, for someone to be there for them, no matter what. Could he be that person? Mrs. Roberts stood quietly by the door, watching him with a knowing look in her eyes. "Ethan, I want you to know that whatever decision you make, it has to come from here," she said, gently placing her hand over her heart. "But I also want to remind you that these girls need someone who's willing to take the leap, even if they're scared." Ethan nodded, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He had been scared for so long, scared of losing more, scared of opening his heart again. But as he looked at Olivia and Abigail, he realized something important. Being scared didn't mean he wasn't ready. It just meant he cared. With a deep breath, Ethan stood up, his hands still resting gently on the cribs. "I'm going to try," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm going to try." Mrs. Roberts smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "That's all anyone can ask for, Ethan, and I think you'll be surprised at how strong you really are." Ethan looked back at the twins, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions: fear, love, hope, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He was still grieving for Grace, and he always would be. But maybe, just maybe, this was a way forward, a way to heal, a way to give these girls the love they deserved. The drive home was different this time. Instead of feeling like a man lost in grief, Ethan felt like a man stepping into a new chapter of his life. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. That night, as he sat in Grace's room, Ethan spoke out loud to the daughter he had lost. "I think I'm ready now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not replacing you, Grace. I could never do that. But I think I can open my heart again, and I hope that's okay." As the house settled into its familiar silence, Ethan felt something different, a sense of peace. Maybe this was the beginning of something beautiful, something that Grace would have wanted for him. Tomorrow, he would call Mrs. Roberts and tell her his decision. He was ready to be a father again, to Olivia and Abigail. And no matter how hard the road ahead would be, he knew one thing for sure. They would walk it together. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the front door of his house, carefully balancing the two car seats with Olivia and Abigail nestled inside. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the familiar scent of his home hitting him like a wave. But today, the house felt different. For the first time in years, it wasn't just a place filled with memories of the past. It was the beginning of something new. "Well, girls," Ethan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "This is it. Welcome home." He set the car seats down gently in the living room. Unbuckling the twins one by one, Olivia blinked sleepily, her tiny fist rubbing at her eyes, while Abigail, more alert, looked around the room with wide, curious eyes. Ethan felt his heart swell as he knelt down beside them, his hand gently brushing Olivia's soft hair. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. He was a father again, this time to two beautiful little girls who needed him just as much as he needed them. The weight of responsibility felt immense. But there was also something else, something lighter: hope. It had been a long time since Ethan had felt that particular emotion, and now it was growing inside him, little by little. He carried Olivia and Abigail to the nursery he had spent the past few weeks preparing. The walls were a soft, warm pink, and two white cribs sat side by side, a rocking chair in the corner. The room was simple but full of love. And as Ethan stood there, holding the twins, he realized that this was the first step toward building a new life, a life that wasn't just about morning grace, but about creating new memories, new laughter. Abigail wriggled in his arms, her little legs kicking excitedly as she reached for the mobile above her crib. Olivia, still sleepy, nestled deeper into his chest, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. "Here we go," Ethan whispered, gently placing them in their cribs. "This is your new home." As he stood between the cribs, watching the twins settle in, a wave of emotion hit him. This was real. He was doing this. He was a father again. And no matter how terrifying that thought was, it also filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Grace was alive. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. Ethan changed their diapers, fed them their bottles, and even managed to coax a few smiles from Abigail, whose infectious giggles lightened the weight in his chest. Olivia, always the quieter of the two, stared at him with wide, thoughtful eyes, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb as he rocked her gently in the nursery. It felt almost easier than he had expected. At least, maybe he was more prepared for this than he thought. But as the evening wore on, the calm began to break. It started with Abigail's soft whimpering, which quickly turned into full-blown crying. Olivia followed suit, her wails piercing the quiet of the house. Ethan rushed to the nursery, his mind racing. He checked their diapers clean. He offered bottles, rejected. He tried rocking them, bouncing them, humming lullabies. But nothing seemed to work. The twins cried louder and louder, their little faces red with effort. Panic started to creep in. What was he doing wrong? He thought back to the parenting classes he had taken, the advice from Mrs. Roberts. But in this moment, none of it seemed to matter. The girls were inconsolable, and Ethan felt helpless. "Sure, it's okay," he murmured, pacing the nursery with one baby in each arm, their cries echoing off the walls. "You're safe here. I've got you." But the crying didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and Ethan felt his heart race with a new kind of fear, one he hadn't felt in years. The fear of failing, of not being enough. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan sank into the rocking chair, his energy spent. Abigail was still wailing in his arms, while Olivia whimpered softly beside him. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he looked down at their upset faces. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm doing." Doubt washed over him, cold and relentless. What if this had been a mistake? What if he wasn't ready to be a father again? These girls needed someone strong, someone capable. And here he was, barely keeping it together after just a few hours. The memories of Grace flooded back, those first sleepless nights when she had been a newborn. How he and his wife had taken turns rocking her, singing softly until she drifted off. But back then, he hadn't been alone. He had had help. Now, it was just him. As the hours dragged on, Ethan finally managed to soothe Olivia and Abigail to sleep. He stood by their cribs, watching their tiny chests rise and fall, their faces peaceful at last. Exhausted, he slumped onto the couch in the living room, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The night had been hard, harder than he had expected, but as he sat there in the quiet, something else settled over him. Despite the chaos, despite the doubt and the fear, they had made it through their first night together. Maybe that was enough for now. Underscore, 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 underscore. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of soft cooing from the nursery. His body ached with exhaustion, but there was a strange sense of peace as he stood up and made his way to the twins. Olivia was awake, her big brown eyes watching him as he entered the room, while Abigail was babbling to herself, her chubby hands reaching for the stuffed bunny that sat in her crib. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he leaned over, gently picking them up. "Good morning, girls," he whispered, his voice softer now, the panic from the night before having faded. "How about we start fresh today?" He carried them into the living room, setting up a soft blanket on the floor and laying them down with a few toys. Abigail immediately reached for a colorful rattle, shaking it with wide-eyed wonder, while Olivia watched her sister quietly, occasionally reaching out to touch the toys, but more content to observe. Ethan sat down beside them, his heart swelling as he watched the girls play. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than grief, something other than emptiness. It wasn't a complete healing, but it was a start. As the day went on, Ethan fell into a rhythm. The twins were demanding, yes, but they were also resilient. And despite the challenges of the night before, there was something undeniably joyful about caring for them. He fed them, changed them, played with them, and when Abigail giggled for the first time, the sound filled the house with a kind of warmth Ethan hadn't felt in years. That evening, as he rocked the girls to sleep, Ethan found himself humming a lullaby, one he hadn't sung since Grace was a baby. His voice wavered at first, but as he continued, the melody soothed not just the twins, but him as well. "Sleep tight, little ones," he whispered as their eyes fluttered closed, their tiny hands resting against his chest. Ethan stood in the nursery, watching them sleep, and for the first time since Grace's death, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect. There would be hard days ahead, he knew that. But in this moment, with Olivia and Abigail safe in their cribs, he realized something important. They weren't just healing, they were healing him too. The house was no longer silent. It was no longer a place filled only with memories of the past. It was alive again, filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional giggle, and the promise of something beautiful. As he turned off the light and gently closed the door to the nursery, Ethan whispered to the darkness, "We're going to be okay. All of us." The sun filtered through the curtains of the nursery, casting a soft golden light across the room. Olivia and Abigail were still asleep, their small forms curled up beneath their blankets. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them. It had only been a few days since he'd brought them home, but it felt like his entire world had shifted. The quiet hum of the house, once so oppressive, now felt soothing. It was the calm after the storm of those first nights. Ethan had found himself crying more than once in the darkness, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd taken on. But somehow, through all the fear and the doubt, he had made it through. The girls had made it through. And for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. He turned and walked softly to the kitchen, where the sunlight was already warming the room. The faint scent of coffee filled the air as he poured himself a cup, sipping it slowly as he stared out the window. The swing set outside creaked in the breeze, but it didn't fill him with the same sharp pain it used to. Instead, it felt like a memory, something he could hold without breaking. As he leaned against the counter, Ethan's mind wandered to Grace. He hadn't spoken about her to anyone in a long time, not even to himself. But now, with Olivia and Abigail in his life, he found himself thinking about her more. Not just the grief of losing her, but the joy she had brought him, the way she had filled the house with laughter and light. Could he give that to Olivia and Abigail? Could he be the father they needed him to be, even though he still carried the weight of his own loss? The sound of soft cooing broke his thoughts. Ethan set his coffee down and made his way back to the nursery. Abigail was the first to wake, her wide eyes blinking up at him as he approached her crib. She stretched out her arms toward him, her tiny fingers wiggling, and Ethan couldn't help but smile. "Good morning, little one," he whispered, lifting her gently out of the crib and cradling her against his chest. Olivia stirred a moment later, her sleepy eyes opening slowly as she looked around the room. "Let's get you both fed," Ethan said softly, carrying Abigail in one arm and reaching for Olivia with the other. The girls snuggled against him as he walked them to the kitchen, the warmth of their small bodies comforting in a way he hadn't expected. As he prepared their bottles, Ethan realized that he was starting to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the doubts crept in, but he was learning. The twins were teaching him how to be a father again, step by step, bottle by bottle, sleepless night by sleepless night. After feeding them, Ethan sat on the floor of the living room, watching as Olivia and Abigail played with their toys. Abigail, always the more curious of the two, reached for a colorful stacking block, her chubby hands trying to fit the pieces together. Olivia, quieter and more observant, watched her sister, occasionally reaching out to touch the blocks, but more content to sit close to Ethan. Ethan smiled as he watched them, a quiet joy blooming in his chest. It wasn't the same kind of joy he had felt with Grace, but it was something new, something different, and maybe that was okay. He picked up a small stuffed bear and waved it in front of Abigail, who giggled and reached for it. Ethan's heart swelled at the sound, and for a moment, he allowed himself to fully embrace it, the joy of this new life, of these two little girls who were now his whole world. The days passed, and Ethan began to find a balance. The chaos of the first few nights had given way to a routine. Mornings were spent playing on the living room floor, afternoons at the park, and evenings rocking the girls to sleep, their tiny hands clutching his shirt as they drifted off. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when both girls would cry at once, and Ethan's patience would wear thin. There were nights when he collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to even think. But those moments were balanced by the softer ones. The times when Abigail would giggle at the sight of a toy, or when Olivia would rest her head against his chest, her eyes closing as she fell asleep. Each day, Ethan felt himself growing more connected to the twins. They weren't just two babies he was responsible for. They were his daughters. And the more he allowed himself to open up to that idea, the more the love grew inside him, filling the spaces that had been empty for so long. One afternoon, as Ethan sat on the floor with the twins, a box of Grace's old toys in front of him, he felt a lump form in his throat. He had kept the box stored away for years, unable to bring himself to look through it. But now, with Olivia and Abigail in his life, it felt right to share these small pieces of Grace with them. He opened the box slowly, the scent of old memories wafting up as he pulled out a set of colorful blocks. Abigail immediately reached for them, her fingers clumsily grasping at the bright shapes. Olivia, always more cautious, watched for a moment before picking up one of the smaller blocks. "These were your sisters," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved these blocks. I think you two will like them too." The twins played quietly, their tiny hands exploring the toys, and Ethan sat back, letting the bittersweet memories wash over him. It didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. Instead, it felt healing, as if by sharing these pieces of Grace's life with Olivia and Abigail, he was keeping her memory alive in a way that wasn't painful but joyful. As the afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Ethan realized something. He had spent so long thinking that moving forward meant leaving Grace behind. But that wasn't true. Grace would always be a part of him, a part of his life. And now, in a way, she was part of Olivia and Abigail's lives too. Ethan glanced over at the mantel, where a photo of Grace sat next to a new picture of Olivia and Abigail. The sight no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once did. Instead, it brought a sense of peace. He was still healing, and he always would be, but he wasn't doing it alone anymore. He had his daughters, both the one he had lost and the ones he had found. Underscore. That evening, after the twins had been fed and bathed, Ethan carried them to their cribs, his arms aching from the long day, but his heart full. He tucked them in, the soft light of the night lamp casting a gentle glow over the room. "Good night, girls," he whispered, leaning down to kiss each of them on the forehead. Olivia snuggled deeper into her blanket, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, while Abigail's eyelids fluttered as she fought sleep. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching them, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. But it wasn't a burden. It was something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. It was contentment. It was the feeling of a life well lived, of love shared, of memories made. As he turned off the light and closed the nursery door, Ethan whispered softly, "We're going to be okay. All of us." And for the first time in years, he truly believed it. The following weeks settled into a pattern that was both comforting and exhausting. Ethan had expected parenthood to be difficult, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer energy it required, especially with twin babies. There were still long, sleepless nights when Abigail would wake crying and Olivia would follow suit, leaving Ethan stumbling through the dark to calm them both. But there were also moments of joy, moments that made all the exhaustion and uncertainty worth it. One morning, after an especially difficult night of teething, Ethan found himself on the living room floor with Olivia in his lap and Abigail playing beside them. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but he couldn't help but smile as he watched Olivia grasp one of the soft blocks he had brought out. She held it up to him, her big brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Look at you, sweetheart," Ethan whispered, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You're getting so big." Abigail, never one to be outdone, crawled over and tugged at his shirt, her toothy grin lighting up her whole face. She babbled excitedly, her tiny hands reaching up toward him. "All right, you too." Ethan laughed, scooping her in his lap alongside Olivia, the weight of them in his arms. The warmth of their little bodies pressed against him filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The twins giggled and squirmed, and Ethan found himself laughing with them, the sound filling the house in a way that hadn't happened in years. It was a different kind of laughter than he had shared with Grace, but it was no less genuine, no less healing. As the days passed, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about the future. He had spent so long trapped in the past, consumed by grief, that he had never really allowed himself to imagine what came next. But now, with Olivia and Abigail in his life, he felt a shift. He began to picture things, small moments, like taking them to school or teaching them how to ride bikes, and bigger ones, like watching them grow into young women. The idea of the future no longer terrified him. It still scared him. Of course, parenthood was full of unknowns, but it also excited him. There was something about the thought of watching these two little girls grow up, of being there for them every step of the way, that filled him with a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch watching the girls play in the yard, Ethan felt that sense of purpose grow even stronger. Abigail was chasing after a butterfly, her little legs wobbling as she toddled across the grass. Olivia, always more cautious, sat in the shade, her eyes following her sister's every move. Ethan smiled as he watched them, his heart swelling with love for these two tiny humans who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. He hadn't thought it was possible to feel this much love again, to open his heart after the loss of Grace. But here he was, filled to the brim with it, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard. Ethan stood up and walked over to the girls. Abigail giggled as she caught sight of him, holding up a dandelion puff, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Look at that," Ethan said, kneeling down beside her. "You found a flower." Abigail beamed, her eyes shining with pride as she handed him the dandelion. Ethan took it, pretending to be amazed, and blew the tiny white seeds into the air. The girls squealed with delight as the seeds floated away, their little hands reaching out to catch them. In that moment, Ethan realized something profound. He was happy. Truly, deeply happy. It wasn't the same kind of happiness he had known before Grace, before the accident, but it was something new, something just as real. It was the happiness of a man who had lost everything and had somehow found his way back to love. That night, after the girls had been bathed and tucked into their cribs, Ethan found himself sitting in the rocking chair, staring out the window at the stars. He often came here in the quiet of the night, after the girls had fallen asleep, to think, to reflect. The memories of Grace were still there. Of course, they always would be, but they didn't hurt as much anymore. The sharp edges of grief had softened over time. And now, when Ethan thought of her, it wasn't just with sadness. There was love there, too, and gratitude. He had been so lucky to have had her in his life, even if it had been for too short a time. But now, his life was about more than just Grace. It was about Olivia and Abigail, about the future they were building together. Ethan sighed softly, his gaze drifting toward the nursery. He couldn't help but wonder what Grace would think of the twins. She had always wanted a little brother or sister, always talked about how she would help take care of them. He imagined her now, as a big sister, and the thought brought a bittersweet smile to his face. "I hope you'd be proud of me," Ethan whispered to the night, his voice barely audible. "I'm doing my best, Grace. I really am." As the house settled into its familiar nighttime silence, Ethan stood up and walked quietly to the nursery. He opened the door just a crack, peeking inside at the two sleeping girls. Abigail was sprawled out, her arms and legs taking up as much space as possible, while Olivia lay curled up on her side, her tiny thumb resting in her mouth. Ethan felt his heart swell with love as he watched them. This was his life now. This was his family, and he was okay with that. More than okay. In fact, the next day brought another challenge. Though it was one Ethan had been expecting, the twins were growing quickly, and with growth came new milestones. That afternoon, as Ethan was preparing lunch, he heard a crash from the living room followed by Abigail's loud wails. His heart leapt into his throat as he rushed into the room, only to find Abigail lying on the floor next to the coffee table, tears streaming down her cheeks. Olivia was sitting nearby, her eyes wide with worry as she watched her sister cry. Ethan scooped Abigail into his arms, cradling her gently as he checked for any sign of injury. She wasn't hurt, just scared, and after a few moments of rocking and soothing words, her cries subsided into soft hiccups. "It's okay, sweetie," Ethan murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're okay. Daddy's got you." He looked over at Olivia, who was still sitting quietly, her little brow furrowed in concern. "See, Olivia," he said softly, smiling down at her. "Your sister's just fine." Olivia nodded slowly, but Ethan could tell she was still worried. He reached out and pulled her into his lap alongside Abigail, holding both girls close as they settled against him. This was parenthood, Ethan realized, not just the laughter and the joy, but the tears and the fears as well. It was about being there for the little moments, both the good and the bad. And in those moments, Ethan knew he was enough. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't perfect, but he was there, and that was what mattered. As the afternoon wore on, the girls fell asleep in his arms, their soft breaths warm against his chest. Ethan sat there for a long time, just holding them, feeling the weight of their trust, their love. He had spent so long wondering if he could ever be a father again, if he could ever love again. But now, as he held Olivia and Abigail close, he realized something important. Love wasn't about replacing what he had lost. It was about expanding. It was about growing. And his heart, which he had once thought broken beyond repair, had somehow grown big enough to hold all three of his daughters, the one he had lost and the two he had found. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the windows, Ethan whispered into the quiet of the room, "We're going to be okay." And for the first time, he believed it with all his heart. The seasons began to change, and with them, Ethan noticed how quickly Olivia and Abigail were growing. It seemed like just yesterday they were tiny babies in his arms, but now they were beginning to crawl, their little hands and knees scurrying across the living room floor with surprising speed. Their laughter filled the house as they explored their surroundings, their curiosity endless. Each new discovery, whether it was the texture of a blanket or the sound of a rattle, seemed to bring them so much joy. And that joy was contagious. Ethan had settled into the rhythms of fatherhood, each day a mix of challenges and quiet triumphs. The once daunting task of caring for two babies had now become his routine. And though it was exhausting, it was also deeply rewarding. Every time Olivia looked at him with her wide brown eyes, or Abigail reached out to touch his face with her chubby hands, Ethan felt that familiar warmth in his chest, a love that was different, but just as deep as the love he had once felt for Grace. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to turn golden and red, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, feeding the twins their breakfast. Abigail, always the more adventurous eater, had her face smeared with oatmeal, while Olivia carefully took each spoonful with a seriousness that made Ethan smile. As he wiped oatmeal off Abigail's nose, he found himself thinking about the upcoming holidays. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a tug at his heart, a desire to make it special. In the past, holidays had been difficult. They were painful reminders of Grace and his wife, of the family he had lost. But this year, things were different. He had Olivia and Abigail now, and the thought of creating new memories with them filled him with both excitement and a little bit of fear. Ethan hadn't celebrated Thanksgiving in a long time. It had seemed impossible to even consider a joyful gathering when his heart was so heavy with grief. But this year, as he looked at the twins, something inside him shifted. He wanted to give them something special, a tradition they could look back on with fondness as they grew older. But what would that tradition look like? Ethan thought back to the Thanksgivings of his childhood, the way his parents would gather everyone around the table. The house filled with the smells of roasted turkey, pumpkin pie, and laughter. He wanted that for Olivia and Abigail. He wanted them to feel the warmth of family, the joy of togetherness, even if their family was small. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Ethan sat in the living room with a notepad in his lap. He started making a list of things he would need: a turkey, of course, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and maybe a pumpkin pie, if he could manage to bake one without setting the kitchen on fire. He laughed quietly at the thought, remembering his failed attempts at baking Grace's birthday cakes when she was younger. But this year, he was determined to get it right. He also decided to invite a few close friends, people who had been there for him during his darkest days, people who had supported him when he adopted Olivia and Abigail. It wasn't going to be a big gathering, but it would be meaningful, and that was what mattered most. Underscore, 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 underscore. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were busy, but filled with anticipation. Ethan found himself bustling around the kitchen more than usual, preparing meals for the girls and practicing a few recipes for the big day. He'd never been much of a cook, but he was determined to make this Thanksgiving special. On the morning of Thanksgiving, Ethan woke up early. He dressed Olivia and Abigail in matching autumn-colored outfits, tiny sweaters and leggings that made them look even more adorable than usual. Abigail immediately started babbling as she crawled around the living room, while Olivia, always more observant, sat quietly, taking in the changes around the house. Ethan had decorated the living room with fall-themed decorations, a wreath made of dried leaves, small pumpkins on the mantel, and a cozy plaid blanket draped over the couch. It wasn't much, but it made the house feel festive. And more importantly, it made it feel like a home as the turkey roasted in the oven, filling the house with its rich aroma. Ethan found himself thinking again about Grace. He wondered what she would think of all this, of the twins, of the effort he was putting into making this day special. He liked to think that she would be proud of him, that she would love her new sisters just as much as he did. For a moment, as he stood in the kitchen stirring the mashed potatoes, he closed his eyes and imagined Grace there with him, helping him prepare the meal, her laughter filling the air. It was a bittersweet thought, but it didn't bring the same sharp pain it once had. Instead, it brought a sense of peace. Underscore. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His friends had arrived, bringing with them dishes of food and an air of excitement. It had been a long time since Ethan had hosted anyone in his home, and though it made him nervous, it also filled him with a deep sense of gratitude. His old friend Mark was the first to step inside, his arms loaded with a casserole dish and a bottle of wine. Mark had been there for Ethan through everything, through the loss of Grace, through the lonely years that followed, and now, through the adoption of the twins. "Look at this place," Mark said, grinning as he stepped into the living room. "You've really outdone yourself, Ethan. It looks amazing." Ethan smiled, feeling a flush of pride. "Thanks, man. I just wanted it to feel right." "And it does," Mark said, setting down the food and bending down to greet Olivia and Abigail. "And these two, they're getting so big." The twins stared up at Mark, their wide eyes curious as they took in the sight of this new person in their home. Abigail, always the bold one, reached out and grabbed Mark's hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb. "She likes you," Ethan said, laughing as Abigail babbled in excitement. "I like her too," Mark replied, his eyes softening as he looked at the girls. "You've done a good thing here, Ethan, a really good thing." As the rest of his friends arrived, the house filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of dishes. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by a warmth that spread through his chest. He looked around the room at his friends, at Olivia and Abigail playing on the floor, and he realized something. This was his family. It wasn't the family he had imagined years ago, but it was a family all the same. As they gathered around the table, Ethan took a deep breath and looked at the faces around him. The turkey sat in the center of the table, golden and steaming, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and stuffing. It wasn't a perfect meal. Ethan's attempt at making pumpkin pie had ended in disaster, but no one seemed to care. What mattered was the love in the room, the sense of togetherness. Before they began to eat, Ethan raised his glass, his heart full of emotion. "I just want to say thank you," he began, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you all for being here, for supporting me, and for being part of my life. This is my first Thanksgiving in a long time, and it wouldn't be the same without each of you here. I'm grateful for my friends, for my family, and for Olivia and Abigail." He glanced down at the twins, who were busy gnawing on their tiny fists, unaware of the significance of the moment. But Ethan knew that one day they would understand. One day they would look back on these moments and know that they were loved. "To new beginnings," Ethan said, lifting his glass higher. "To new beginnings," his friends echoed, raising their glasses in return. As they began to eat, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had been missing all those years, the warmth of love, the joy of connection, the sense of belonging. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Later, as the house quieted down and his friends left, Ethan found himself alone with Olivia and Abigail once again. He carried them upstairs, their tiny bodies warm and heavy with sleep. After tucking them into their cribs, he stood by the door for a moment, watching them. "Thank you," he whispered, not really knowing who he was thanking. Maybe Grace, maybe the universe, or Maybe just the part of himself that had kept going when everything seemed lost. Thank you for giving me this. And as he closed the door to the nursery, Ethan knew one thing for sure. They were going to be okay. The quiet that followed Thanksgiving lingered like a soft blanket over the house. Ethan had grown used to the constant sound of voices, the clinking of dishes, and the laughter of friends. Now, the house was once again filled with the familiar rhythms of Olivia and Abigail's babbling and the occasional creak of the old swing set outside. But the sense of warmth and connection from the holiday still echoed within him. Winter was setting in, and with it came the cozy evenings spent by the fire. The world outside growing colder, while inside, things were beginning to feel warm and alive again. The girls were growing fast, and each day brought a new milestone that left Ethan both amazed and a little breathless at how quickly time was passing. One afternoon, while the sky outside was heavy with the promise of snow, Ethan sat on the living room floor with Olivia and Abigail. A fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with a soft orange glow. The twins were playing with a set of soft, colorful blocks, their tiny hands grasping and stacking them with intense concentration. Ethan watched them, his heart swelling with the same mixture of pride and wonder that had become a regular part of his days. Abigail, ever the explorer, was attempting to build the tallest tower she could, while Olivia quietly observed, occasionally placing a block on top of her sister's work, but more content to watch the world around her. "Look at you go, Abby," Ethan murmured, smiling as Abigail's tower wobbled under her careful touch. "You're going to be an engineer one day, aren't you?" Abigail glanced up at him, her chubby cheeks dimpling with a grin, as if she knew exactly what he was saying. Olivia, always more thoughtful, looked up too, her wide brown eyes meeting Ethan's with a quiet intensity that made his heart skip a beat. He often saw grace in those eyes, not in a painful way anymore, but in a way that reminded him of the connection between the past and the future, of how life carried on, even through loss. After a while, the girls grew tired, their energy spent after a long afternoon of play. Ethan scooped them up, one in each arm, and carried them upstairs to the nursery. As he laid them down in their cribs, their eyes already heavy with sleep, he couldn't help but think about how far they had come in such a short time. Underscore. The nights had grown easier, but there were still moments of doubt that crept in, often when the house was at its quietest. After putting the girls to bed, Ethan would sometimes find himself sitting in the nursery, staring out the window at the snow that was beginning to fall, his thoughts drifting back to Grace, back to the life he had lived before. It wasn't that he was unhappy, far from it, but there was still a part of him that struggled with the weight of it all. Being a single father was hard, and there were moments when the responsibility felt overwhelming, when he wondered if he was really doing enough for Olivia and Abigail. He loved them with everything he had, but there were times when that didn't feel like it was enough. On one of those quiet nights, Ethan found himself sitting in the nursery after the girls had fallen asleep. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the nightlight. And outside, the first snow of the season was gently falling, blanketing the world in white. Ethan leaned back in the rocking chair, his eyes on the twins as they slept. They were peaceful now, their tiny chests rising and falling in rhythm with their deep, even breaths. For a moment, everything felt still, and Ethan allowed himself to breathe in the calm. But as the quiet settled in around him, so did the thoughts, the doubts that had been hovering at the edges of his mind. Was he doing enough? Could he really raise these girls on his own? The memories of Grace came flooding back, unbidden but not unwelcome. He could see her so clearly in his mind, her bright eyes, her laughter, the way she would run into his arms at the end of the day, full of stories and energy. The love he had felt for her had been so overwhelming, so all-encompassing. And now, with Olivia and Abigail, he felt that same kind of love, but it was tinged with something else, fear. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair. He had come so far, and yet there were days when it felt like he was still stumbling through the dark. trying to figure out how to be the father these girls deserved. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough, if he was doing enough, if he could really fill the role that they needed him to. The sound of a soft whimper pulled him from his thoughts. Olivia stirred in her crib, her small face scrunching up as she let out a tiny cry. Without thinking, Ethan stood up and crossed the room, gently lifting her into his arms. "Shoo, it's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, rocking her gently as her cries softened into quiet hiccups. "Daddy's here." He sat back down in the rocking chair, cradling Olivia against his chest as she snuggled into him, her tiny hands grasping at his shirt. Ethan rested his cheek against the top of her head, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent of baby shampoo. Her warmth pressed against him, her soft breaths slowing as she began to relax. As he rocked her back and forth, Ethan felt the tension in his own body begin to ease. The weight of his doubts and fears seemed to lift, just for a moment, as he focused on the steady rhythm of Olivia's breathing, the soft rise and fall of her chest against his. This was what mattered, the love he felt for these girls, the way he showed up for them every day, even when it was hard. That was enough. It had to be enough. He closed his eyes, letting the steady motion of the rocking chair soothe him as much as it soothed Olivia. The quiet stretched out around them. The only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the next room and the gentle hum of the snow falling outside. "I love you, Olivia," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "I love you and your sister more than anything, and I promise, I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He knew there would be hard days ahead, days when the doubts would creep back in, when the exhaustion would weigh heavy on his shoulders. But he also knew that this love, this connection he had with Olivia and Abigail, was stronger than any of those fears. As Olivia drifted back to sleep in his arms, Ethan stood up slowly and laid her back down in her crib. He tucked her blanket around her, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead before stepping back to look at both girls. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, the words a quiet promise to himself as much as to them. "We'll figure it out together." Underscore, 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 underscore. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Abigail's laughter echoing through the house. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and hurried downstairs to find the twins in their playpen. Already wide awake and full of energy, Abigail was busy stacking blocks, her little face lighting up with each successful addition to her tower. While Olivia sat nearby, quietly chewing on a soft toy, Ethan smiled as he watched them, his heart swelling with love. The doubts from the night before seemed distant now, replaced by the simple joy of watching his daughters grow and thrive. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, Ethan realized something important. The future was uncertain, and there would always be moments of fear and doubt. But in the quiet moments, in the small acts of love and care, he was building something stronger than those fears. He was building a life with Olivia and Abigail, a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. And that was more than enough. Winter came in full force not long after that first snowfall, transforming the world outside into a cold, glittering landscape. The days grew shorter, and the nights longer. But inside Ethan's house, things remained warm. The fire in the hearth crackled every evening, and the laughter of Olivia and Abigail filled the space where, for so long, there had been only silence. For Ethan, the long winter days were both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, they brought him closer to the twins. He spent hours with them, reading books, stacking blocks, and teaching them new words. But on the other hand, the cold and isolation of winter also gave rise to moments of loneliness and reflection. There were days when the outside world seemed so distant, and the house, despite the warmth of the fire, felt too quiet once the girls were asleep. It was in those quiet moments that Ethan's thoughts would often drift back to Grace. Her absence was still felt, like a shadow that followed him even in the happiest moments. He loved Olivia and Abigail deeply, But the love he had for Grace was different. It was a love forged from shared history, from the years they had spent together. He had promised himself he would never let the pain of losing her interfere with his love for the twins. But on some days, it was hard. One particular evening, after the twins had been put to bed, Ethan found himself sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the snow-covered trees. The fire flickered softly behind him, but his thoughts were far away. He remembered the winters when Grace had been alive, the way she would race outside to make snow angels, her cheeks flushed with cold, her laughter echoing across the yard. He had never felt so much joy as in those moments. Watching her play, knowing she was safe and happy, a lump formed in his throat as he thought about how different his life had become. He had two beautiful daughters now, Olivia and Abigail, but there were days when the weight of it all felt almost too much to bear. He had been through so much loss, and now, as a single father, he carried the fear of not being enough for the girls, of not being able to give them everything they needed. Ethan closed his eyes, resting his head in his hands. "I'm trying, Grace," he whispered into the quiet. "I'm doing my best." The words hung in the air, unanswered. He wasn't expecting a response, but still, the silence was heavy. The next morning, the world outside was buried under a fresh blanket of snow, and Ethan decided to introduce the girls to the magic of winter. After bundling Olivia and Abigail up in their warmest coats, hats, and mittens, he carried them outside, the cold air biting at his cheeks as he set them down in the snow. Abigail, ever the adventurer, immediately began to wiggle and kick, her tiny boots sinking into the snow as she tried to move around. Olivia, more cautious, stayed close to Ethan, her wide eyes watching her sister's antics with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Ethan knelt down beside them, scooping up a handful of snow and showing it to Olivia. "Look, sweetheart," he said, smiling as the tiny flakes glistened in the sunlight. "It's snow. You can touch it." Olivia hesitated for a moment before reaching out with one mittened hand to touch the snow in Ethan's palm. Her eyes widened in surprise as the cold seeped through her glove, and she let out a quiet giggle, her lips curling into a soft smile. "That's right," Ethan chuckled, feeling his heart swell at the sight of her smile. "It's cold, but it's fun." He turned to Abigail, who was already halfway across the yard, her tiny legs moving awkwardly through the deep snow. "What about you, Abby? You like the snow?" Abigail glanced back at him, her face lit up with excitement, and babbled something unintelligible, her cheeks red from the cold. Ethan laughed, standing up and following her across the yard, his boots crunching in the snow. They spent the next hour outside, Ethan helping the girls make their first snowman, a lopsided figure with a carrot for a nose and pebbles for eyes. It wasn't much, but to Olivia and Abigail, it was magic. Their giggles filled the air as they patted snow onto the snowman's body, their little hands clumsy in their thick mittens. As Ethan watched them play, he felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire waiting inside. This was what mattered, these moments of joy, of discovery. Watching the girls experience the world for the first time reminded him of the simple pleasures of life, the ones he had forgotten in the midst of his grief. Maybe that was part of what being a father was, learning to see the world through their eyes, to find the beauty in the small things again. In some ways, Olivia and Abigail were teaching him as much as he was teaching them. Later that night, after the girls were bathed and tucked into bed, Ethan sat in the rocking chair, staring out at the snow-covered yard. He thought about the day they had spent outside, the laughter, the snowman. It had been a good day, a reminder that there was still so much to be grateful for, even in the midst of the harder moments. His thoughts drifted back to Grace, as they often did in the quiet moments. He wondered what she would have thought of the snowman, of watching Olivia and Abigail play in the snow. He liked to think she would have been proud of him, that she would have smiled at the sight of her sisters giggling and running through the yard. The ache in his chest was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as it once had been. Over the months, it had softened into something more manageable, a reminder of the love he had lost, but also of the love he had found again in Olivia and Abigail. Ethan glanced at the small photograph of Grace that still sat on the mantelpiece, her bright eyes and mischievous smile looking back at him. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "but I think we're going to be okay." And in that moment, Ethan knew that was the truth. The pain of losing Grace would always be a part of him, but so would the joy of raising Olivia and Abigail. It wasn't about moving on or forgetting. It was about finding a way to carry both the love and the loss, to let them coexist in his heart without overshadowing each other. He stood up from the rocking chair and made his way upstairs to the nursery. The soft glow of the night light bathed the room in a warm, golden light, and Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching his daughters sleep. They were growing so fast, changing every day, and with each new milestone, Ethan felt both a deep pride and a pang of sadness. He wanted to hold on to these moments, to freeze time and keep them small and safe forever. But he knew that wasn't how life worked. They would grow, and so would he. And as they grew, they would continue to teach him, just as he had promised to teach them. "We'll figure it out together," he whispered, repeating the words he had said so many times before. And as he closed the door softly behind him, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him, deeper than any he had known in a long time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new lessons. But for tonight, he was content. Winter deepened as the holidays approached, and with each passing day, Ethan found himself more immersed in the day-to-day joys and challenges of fatherhood. Olivia and Abigail were growing fast, their personalities continuing to blossom in ways that never ceased to surprise him. As he looked ahead to their first Christmas together, Ethan felt a mix of emotions. The holidays had always been a difficult time since losing Grace. But this year, with the twins, there was something new, a feeling of anticipation, of hope, and of building something that could last. Christmas had always been a big deal when Grace was alive. Ethan and his wife had made it a point to create memorable traditions, decorating the tree, baking cookies, singing carols by the fire. Those memories were now bittersweet, tinged with the pain of loss. But as Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, watching Olivia and Abigail toddle around in their new winter outfits, he realized that it was time to create new traditions. This was their life now, and it was filled with new beginnings. One evening, Ethan decided to take the twins out to see the Christmas lights in the neighborhood. He bundled them up in their warmest coats, hats, and mittens, their wide eyes peeking out from under their hats. Curious about the adventure ahead, he had borrowed a double stroller from a neighbor, and after securing the girls inside, he set off down the quiet street, the crisp winter air biting at his cheeks. The neighborhood had transformed into a winter wonderland. Houses were decked out in twinkling lights, inflatable snowmen, and glowing reindeer, and each display seemed to captivate Olivia and Abigail in a new way. Abigail pointed excitedly at every new light she saw, her little voice filled with awe. Olivia, more subdued but equally fascinated, gazed up at the lights with wide eyes, her hands clutching the blanket Ethan had wrapped around her. As they walked, Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. There was something magical about seeing the world through their eyes. Everything was new and exciting for them, and their wonder was contagious. It was as if, for the first time in years, he could feel the magic of the holiday season again, not in the way it used to be, but in a way that was just as real and just as meaningful. After about an hour, Ethan noticed the girls starting to yawn, their little faces pink from the cold. He turned the stroller around and began making his way back home, the snow crunching underfoot as he walked. Back at the house, he settled the twins into their high chairs for a snack while he heated up some milk. Abigail was still buzzing with excitement from the lights, babbling away in her own little language, while Olivia sat quietly, sucking on her thumb, her eyes already drooping with sleepiness. Ethan smiled as he placed the warmed milk in front of them. "Did you like the lights, girls?" he asked, though he knew they couldn't answer him in words just yet. Still, the way they looked at him, their faces lit up with contentment, was enough of a response. As they finished their snack, Ethan took them upstairs for their baths and bedtime routine. The nights had become easier as the girls grew older, and their routines more predictable. After giving them both warm baths, he dressed them in their soft pajamas, read them a short story, and then tucked them into their cribs. He kissed each of them goodnight, brushing a hand softly over their hair, and turned on the night light before quietly leaving the room. Later that night, after the girls were sound asleep, Ethan found himself sitting on the couch in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights casting shadows on the walls. He held a cup of tea in his hands, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic into his palms. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to Grace. He could still picture her as clearly as if she were sitting beside him, her bright eyes and wide smile. The way she used to throw herself into everything with such enthusiasm, especially around the holidays. It had been years since he'd felt any real excitement for Christmas. But now, with Olivia and Abigail, it was starting to return. Ethan stared at the tree, his eyes tracing the familiar shapes of the ornaments, some old, carried over from past holidays with Grace, and some new, ones he had picked out with the twins in mind. This was his life now, and he was starting to realize that it didn't have to be about choosing between the past and the present. He could honor Grace's memory while still building something new with Olivia and Abigail. And in that moment, he made a decision. He stood up, went to the small chest in the corner of the room, and pulled out a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the ornaments Grace had made when she was little, hand-painted glass balls, paper snowflakes, and a few other keepsakes from her childhood. Ethan had tucked them away after she passed, unable to bear the sight of them. But tonight, he felt ready. Taking a deep breath, Ethan carefully pulled out one of the ornaments, a small, delicate glass angel that Grace had painted when she was 5 years old. It had always been her favorite, and it was the one they always placed at the top of the tree together. He walked back to the tree, gently placing the ornament on one of the highest branches. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted it, making sure it was secure. Then he stepped back, looking at the tree with a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. This was a new chapter, a chapter where Grace's memory was still very much alive, but where Olivia and Abigail were the ones who would carry the joy of Christmas forward. Ethan knew that no matter how much time passed, Grace would always be a part of their lives, but he also knew that his heart had grown big enough to make room for more. The next morning, the house was filled with the smell of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee. Ethan had decided to start the day with a special breakfast, pancakes shaped like snowmen, something Grace had always loved. The twins were still too young to understand the significance, but their giggles and messy faces as they ate made it all worthwhile. As they sat around the table, Olivia reaching for more pancakes while Abigail smeared syrup across her high-chair tray, Ethan felt a wave of contentment wash over him. These moments, these small, seemingly insignificant moments, were what life was really about. It wasn't about the big, grand gestures or the perfect holiday traditions. It was about the love that filled the spaces in between. After breakfast, Ethan bundled the girls up again and took them outside to play in the snow. The day was crisp and clear, the sun shining down on the snow-covered yard, making everything sparkle. They spent hours making snow angels and building another snowman, this one a bit more elaborate than the first. Olivia and Abigail's laughter echoed through the air, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt completely present in the moment. He didn't think about what had been lost. He didn't worry about what the future would bring. Instead, he focused on the here and now, on the joy of watching his daughters experience the world, on the warmth that filled his heart as they played together. Later, as the sun began to set and the sky turned shades of pink and purple, Ethan carried the twins back inside, their cheeks red from the cold, their eyes heavy with sleep. After changing them into their pajamas and settling them into bed, he stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching them sleep. "We're doing all right, aren't we?" he whispered, though the words were as much for himself as for anyone else. As he turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were doing more than all right. They were building something beautiful, something filled with love. And that was all that mattered. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Ethan's life as he finds love, healing, and new beginnings with Olivia and Abigail. We hope this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength found in family and the beauty of creating new memories. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more inspiring